semantic SEO is SEO. The phrase does not appear in the document, but somehow it is still ranking. I would definitely not recommend to use Google Gemini to write content. Very obviously why. Most of the web actually runs on semantic principles. AI is very, very convincing and it makes itself look like it's very reliable, but unfortunately it's not. So that's a really dangerous thing for Google to have, which is why they have to prevent it, they have to protect their system. Google is actually trying and testing a lot of different use cases to replace different types of parts of algorithms with LLM evaluations.
Why some competitors fake queries?
I think most SEOs actually forget that the searches, they come from real people. Just remind yourself of your source context. Because if you know you're not selling that, already signals that this is really not that important. And many times they actually miss lots of different really important queries that belong to that specific micro part of the sphere. Things which queries have a dedicated spot within Google's attention. How does Google actually create different indices? And what is, let's say, a real index or what is a merged index? Primarily, this is more about how do you make money with your website? How does your business make money? Which part exactly is being monetized?
Wondering which domains are winning right now? Now you don't have to wonder, nor do the work to find out. We research, test, and identify the trends for you before they peak. New release every week, limited inventory. Subscribe to Odys Trends now. Hi, welcome back to Odys Podcast. My name is Aneta Samkoff and we're here today at SEO Vibes in Zakopane, and my guest is Pavel Klimakov, who is semantic search researcher and thought leader in the Holistic SEO community. Thank you so much for coming today, Pavel.
Thank you so much for inviting me here.
So we're going to talk about semantic search, like kind of for beginners, but also getting into deeper topics. What's the biggest misconception SEOs have about semantic search?
I think just relying on keywords and regular queries and thinking that you can still kind of get away by just following the slightly older principles of kind of focusing on queries or focusing on keywords and sort of overloading them throughout your site, throughout your content, and essentially thinking that there would be no kind of problems or consequences. I think that's one of the kind of overlooked misconceptions, which naturally leads to, let's say, just much poorer thought out sites in terms of content layout, functionality, and let's say lots of other things, including technical stuff and things like that. And that's where just on the surface level, you can already see a very significant difference between a really well planned out website or something that's just kind of, like a draft on a napkin or like a sketch on a napkin. Just something was put in place and then something else was added and something else was added. And in the end, you have like a semi-mutated working website, but also with lots of problems. So that's one of these things.
Okay. So what exactly is semantic search? How does it differ from regular?
Sure. So essentially, well, if we say, let's say, regular search, it a little bit depends on the timeline when we say what is regular. Because I think now most of the web actually runs on semantic principles.
Okay.
And there are even, let's say, kind of additional companies or APIs or systems put in place to make any kind of search a semantic search. To the point, if, let's say, if you have just a WordPress website where you can search for different things, let's say, by standard configuration, that is that old standard search that would look for essentially phrase matching. But even there, you can essentially attach additional functionalities that will turn that old primitive search into a semantic search. And so the difference here is that those older systems, they are just looking for a query match or a phrase match, or in a, let's say, engineering terms, it is properly called string matching, essentially string matching algorithms, things like BM25 and things like that. And the difference in semantics is that it focuses on the meaning. It tries to understand what do you intend and then tries to give you those results. The biggest difference, that's probably the easiest one to understand, is that In a traditional search, if you're looking for something, let's say you have a phrase or a query or a keyword, and that has to appear within the document. If it's a slightly more advanced traditional string matching search, you can have, let's say, synonyms or some variants, like, let's say, singular, plural, again, things like synonyms and stuff like that appearing there. But there's still a very strong match in terms of words. In semantics, you can have a case where you're searching for a phrase, the phrase does not appear in the document, but somehow it is still ranking. So there is no that query or a keyword that was embedded into the article that makes it rank. There is a more conceptual understanding that, let's say, this request intends that, and even though it is not mentioned, it is still a very good response. So you can see a very, really strong difference here. And the point is that it's just a much better technology for the users, for engineers, really for everyone. It's kind of like a, let's say, next step in evolution of search, but it's really not the next step because it already happened and now it's transforming into something else.
So would you say in 2025, semantic search is the search?
Yes, exactly. This is also why really semantic SEO is SEO. There is no kind of something else to it. Because essentially that's the working principle.
What's the difference between semantic search and vector search?
So vector search, it is really mostly about embedding both the query and the document and doing embedding-based retrieval. This is a function or a tool that is being used by the semantic search. So you can think of it as this, like vector search is a part of semantic search. It's just one of the functionalities that exists there. And how is semantic search bigger? There's just a lot more things that happen within the processing and both retrieval. Especially, let's say, things can try to understand the query and the document, try to, let's say, focus on certain entities or relations of different entities. There could be additional things involved, like semantic role labeling and things like that. And this is mostly about just trying to interpret and understand things programmatically, what was asked and how to answer that more correctly. So just embeddings or just vector search will not do a perfect job there all the time. Sometimes you need to, let's say, do certain corrections or additions. And the point is that, let's say, as I mentioned, vector search is just a tool or a kind of one of the tools, or let's say one of the techniques to understand and process text. There are lots of other techniques that exist as well. The thing we mentioned earlier, the string matching, is also one of these techniques. It's just, as you understand, a very, very primitive one. And so, yeah, it's more about, just to answer the question, that's essentially the main difference. Vector search is just one of the smaller, let's say, parts of the full spectrum of semantic search.
Thank you. And topical authority is an important concept in semantic search. Can you tell us what it is and why is it important?
Sure. So let's say I will give you maybe a simpler to understand analogy, because I've seen lots of people try to answer this question. And I think it's all of those answers kind of seem the same or similar or repeated. So I would say, if we try to look into the Google's brain, we're going to look inside of it. We will realize that Google looks at the whole world as, let's say, in an imaginary world, imaginary scenario, it's a kind of, let's say, sphere or a kind of globe. You can imagine a whole planet, let's say. So that's everything that can potentially exist. Now over here, in order for Google to do retrieval efficiently, because they have billions of queries happening every single day, they actually need to split this sphere into different domains. Domains, in this case, I don't mean domain names, I mean knowledge domains. Things like history, something that I heard you're expert at, or arts, also a part of your expertise. Let's say things related to medicine or legal things or sports and things like that. So now you can imagine this sphere being split into lots of different domains that exist within it. Now over here, you also have, let's say, additional layers or sub-layers. Because, we can, let's say, talk about arts, but how many types of arts are there? How many artists are there? Are we talking about the past, the future, the trends, the styles, right? There's lots and lots of different things. So when it comes to topical authority, it is within this sphere, within this globe, you find your piece, you find that environment where you belong, and you try to become the most important source that anytime anyone asks about your topic, you're always there to answer that. And that's really what is, let's say, topical authority. It is essentially trying to serve every single user within your industry, or maybe your direct clients or potential clients, but you're always right there in front of them for whatever needs they might have.
And how does this relate to micro-semantics and macro-semantics? What are those?
Sure. So this is a little bit more, let's say, technical, or just a bit more about the actual process of, let's say, performing the strategy of topical authority. But ultimately, it is, for the macro-semantics part, these are, let's say, a top-level kind of macro elements on the website. Mostly, let's say, things like how many pages do we need to open, and what these pages should talk about, and then what's the structure for each one of these pages. Mostly it is done through, let's say, asking questions, unless we're dealing with a kind of listicle. But ultimately it is, well, let's say, sort of prioritize and organize all of these different concepts in terms of, we know we need to cover everything and we need to explain everything that exists within our industry, but we need to realize, how do we process that? Where do we need a separate page where we combine things in, let's say, a single page, or how much should we say related to a specific thing within that single page? So it is kind of like a macro configuration. You can think of it as a kind of macro plan for what should appear on the website. When it comes to micro semantics, is the actual, let's say, micro tiny details in terms of what kind of facts should we present, what kind of sentences do we use, how much of specific information do we provide within every single paragraph or phrase, or even specific, let's say, words and phrases that we should be using. So it's like down to the word level, essentially, even in some cases, in, let's say, complete extreme scenarios, down to the character level. That's the, like, micro semantics, micro optimization. Just to give a, let's say, side note here, semantics, the word semantics, it is a synonym to the word meaning. So let's say semantic SEO equals meaningful SEO, or SEO that's focused on the meaning. So on this part, you can understand there's a kind of macro level to signaling the meanings of our website from a kind of, let's say, macro signals or the, like, overall layout. And then there is micro signals in terms of what are we able to say, how well we're able to say that, do we actually have a kind of consensus or repeated truth within our website, or things like that. So it's, let's say, micro tiny details within the content. That would be a simpler answer.
And how is source context related to that? What is this?
Sure. So source context, first thing, the word source represents your domain, your website, and your business ultimately. And then the context is ultimately the part where, what is the angle that we should take to exactly enter into that sphere or that part of the sphere. Primarily, this is more about how do you make money with your website? How does your business make money? Which part exactly is being monetized? This becomes a kind of, in a simple analogy, imagine these old wooden ships that used to sail. And whenever they need to stop somewhere, they would drop the anchor.
Yeah.
And now they can still kind of, let's say, float slightly left to right, but they're anchored in this area. This is what we're doing with the source context. We basically say we are a company that, let's say, focuses on, let's say, cars. So we're in the knowledge domain of cars now. But what exactly do we do with these cars? Do we repair them? If we repair them, we are a mechanic. Do we, let's say, try to innovate and improve them? Then we are actually engineers and researchers. Or are we, let's say, try to race these cars? Like we try to tune them and do kind of like street shows. Now it's about, organizing events and essentially decorating cars to some point. So exact same object, but we take a very, very different angle in terms of what we will be talking about. And just to give a little bit more context here, you can realize that sometimes a mechanic and a company that, let's say, focuses on street shows, they can talk about similar things, but they will have a very different angle towards how they talk about that. For example, people who are fans of, like, let's say, drag racing and street racing, they will say, you can push your engine to these limits because it's fun, it goes faster. But a mechanic would say that's potentially bad and dangerous, or you can wear off the engine much sooner. So in order to have a very clear, aligned precision for, let's say, not conflict with our own statements. Let's say we write one article and another one, we cannot contradict ourselves. So in order to avoid these types of situations and have everything clearly and easily aligned, it is extremely helpful to exactly anchor yourself and say, this is what we do. And now there's a very, let's say, clear priority for what is actually the most important thing for us, because that is the actual monetization part, right? What are we selling? And then based off of that, we can sort of work it outwards in terms of what should we cover, how should we cover within the website, how should we design the website, and what should be these different elements that should be a part of, let's say, even the brand and the overall thing that we present on the web as an entity. Is that clear?
Yes. So now that you explained all those important concepts, can you actually tell us how to go about building authority correctly? Building topical authority correctly?
Sure. So one of the first things, of course, you will start with figuring out what is your source context, exactly what are you selling. Based off of that, you will have a kind of, let's say, an object, which essentially is an entity, or maybe it could be a group of objects in case, let's say, you have an e-commerce store and you're selling lots of products. So that's no longer a single thing that you're focused on, but it could be a kind of combination of them. Ideal scenario is that if you're able to group them in a kind of very clearly representative type of way. So let's say, if we're talking about snowboarding or things like that, you can focus on everything related to snowboarding, including just snowboarding gear. It's, let's say, like helmets, gloves, pants, different safety gear for the knees, elbows, etc. And of course, the snowboards themselves. At the same time, you can also focus on just a single thing in itself. If I give a let's say, separate example, if you focus on, let's say, just the word skateboard, that becomes essentially your main product that you're focused on. The next part over here, when you realize precisely what you're selling or what's the range of the things that you're selling, try to It's a little bit more technical, but it's very good to understand index construction in terms of how does Google actually create different indices and what is, let's say, a real index or what is a merged index. Essentially, not really existing one. There's just lots of different things combined from other indices. What this does, in what I'm talking about here, is essentially within that sphere, within that specific part that we try to enter, that part is also split into micro subparts. And we need to navigate and find precisely which things, which queries have a dedicated spot within Google's attention, let's say. That's where we want to go in and start competing. We don't want to go into essentially a piece that doesn't exist where in Google's mind, where it doesn't really pay attention. This mostly comes from search demands and in some cases document statistics and certain, let's say, behaviors of documents on the web in general. But for the simplicity's sake, you can try to understand the search volumes, and then the next part is the actually semantic search, because indices usually would be built either for the entity itself or the entity and attribute pairs. In some cases, it could be built for certain templates. I think one of the most known templates is the how-to. So it's how to do something, let's say how to repair, how to fix, how to draw, etc. These are, let's say, small hints, but it is a quite vast thing to try to process. But it's an extremely essential one. This allows you to essentially envision a kind of environment where the whole game of SEO will be played. You can kind of realize where the borders or boundaries are. And then once you see these boundaries, then you can say, okay, we're going to start from this part. We're going to, let's say, process everything and then expand further and further and further until we cover precisely everything.
So maybe if you could give us simple first couple steps to build the topical authority, basic stuff.
Sure. So it comes back to the source context first. Then I would say try to, in a practical way, try to find all of your competitors, even that you think are maybe slightly remote ones, or maybe not even your competitors. Analyze their sitemaps, analyze their title tags, try to understand what entities they try to focus on, what exactly do they process. If you can, let's say, evaluate the content in terms of how deep and how deep they process it and how often they, let's say, refresh it or how well they maintain it. This can give you certain signals in terms of where there potentially could be more commercial activity, or there could be a slightly higher competition in terms of sites constantly keep everything refreshed on those levels. This helps you navigate and understand so far what all of your competition has covered. Ideally, if you're an expert in your own niche and you actually understand all of the, let's say, your knowledge domain related terms and topics. Many times, if, let's say, just an SEO does a kind of campaign, they will mostly follow queries. They'll also follow competitors in this type of way. And many times they actually miss lots of different really important queries that belong to that specific micro part of the sphere. But because it didn't appear in the queries, or these were the queries that were harder to find, they will just miss that. So this is a big advantage point of working with the actual experts in the industry, because they can help you enrich your overall content network that you will process in the later stages. And so from this part, once you see a clear picture, what your competitors have done, what you will be doing, I think it will be, let's say, a very positive scenario where you can see that your competitors are either outdated or they have completely missed certain points within the information that they present. that should be a more positive sign for you to, let's say, be more excited to go and perform the campaign, because essentially these are easier scenarios to deal with. And from over here, it's time to design the actual, let's say, briefs for every single article. Slightly before that, it's important to understand the index construction, to understand what should we process on which page. In a scenario where, let's say, we have a really important thing we need to explain about engines, but we can see that there's no specific separate demands, there's no queries that are asking something like that. We still need to find where we can integrate this piece of information within the sort of safe indices or indexes that exist, to not create problems for ourselves and sort of to minimize the overall size of contents that we try to present to Google, but still keeping it dense and information rich. A small visual scenario over here. If you try to, let's say, draw an actual knowledge graph where you, let's say, on an example with cars, a very simple scenario. Imagine you're drawing dots on a chalkboard and you're trying to connect all of the dots with a line. So if we need to explain what is a car, we will probably talk about things like its engine, we'll talk about suspension, we'll talk about wheels, the driving wheel, seats, right? Imagine that how many things exist in the car. Every single one of those things is a dot. You need to cover all of these dots and connect them to each other. And that's what actually completes the explanation of a word like a car. Of course, in different domains, there are these types of concepts. And so as we evaluated competitors, now we have a very clear plan for what we will be doing. It's time to align things to see that, let's say, maybe competitors opened 5 different pages for essentially the same object. And maybe that's a very wrong thing to do. So that's where we can easily win by just basically compressing the information into just a single page and making it way more digestible for Google. They just need to process one page where everything's already covered, instead of trying to maintain and refresh and recrawl different pages. So the biggest hint here is really studying the principles of index construction. That really helps solve, I would say, like almost 80% of these types of questions or problems.
Okay, so how actually do you figure out the correct topical radius, meaning how far from the topic can you go before you get hurt?
So one of the things I should mention that, first of all, it starts with actually getting experience. So it's a little bit about doing it and kind of feeling it throughout the process, and then realizing that meaning-wise, we're actually shifting a little bit too far away. A very important in the, let's say, a mechanism why this happens is whenever you create briefs, you try to stick to a single entity or entity attribute pair, or a template, or specific types of contexts. If you remember what we mentioned earlier, that's exactly how Google builds or constructs their indices. So there is exactly that type of match that happens here. And then you realize that if you try to, let's say, because you need to connect all of these things to each other, when, let's say, we have that object of a car that we work with, and then, let's say, for a funny thing, for some reason we want to talk about bananas, in a logical order of questions, you would need to add a lot of things in between before you can start, let's say, asking with something like banana related to the car or things like that, or even prioritizing the word banana and then using the word car as something sequential or consequential. So there are always ways to integrate different things, but it's much more important what do we precisely focus on. Because if we do put the focus on like imagine on that map of dots where everything is interconnected, for some reason a word like, let's say, apple or banana appears. How the hell are we going to connect everything related to, let's say, engines and their types and the types of fuels that are being used and different mileage, things to the fruit? We really need to ask lots and lots and lots of things in between to make that kind of connection. And the more questions you need in between, the longer is that meaningful distance. You can realize it is kind of like a common sense thing. And another tip I can give here is just remind yourself of your source context. Because if you know you're not selling that, that already signals that this is really not that important. Okay. But if that object or thing, or let's say a template or a pattern or something like that, if it helps you explain the other things around your core entities that you focused on, that is still a good thing, because there is a kind of lateral, I don't know if that's a word in English, but I mean ladder type of connection, because they're really, let's say, precisely close. What I mean here, for example, if you deal with, let's say, music studio or music equipment, it is not hurtful for you, it is very beneficial for you to explain how like audio waves work and how the air moves. Because that directly then shows, I assume, I'm not an expert in these audio equipments, but things like decibels and different types of equipments will be probably highly responsive to these things. So these are like intertwined domains or intertwined points of information. And a lot of them are assumed. If you're explaining about the sensitivity of microphone, these things are assumed, like, let's say it captures voice really well, but what is voice? Voice is a sound wave. That's why if you explain sound waves and different working principles behind them, it all helps you prove that you actually know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And another simple thing here, think of it like this. Imagine yourself that you would go to a mechanic, and then before working with them, you're actually gonna ask them like 100 different questions. And you realize that your mechanic, let's say, is not able to tell you the difference between different types of engines or between different types of fuels, or let's say gasoline versus diesel and these types of things. So on the information or knowledge level, you would feel very not confident in them. Mm-hmm. Yes, they are dressed as a mechanic, but maybe you cannot really trust them if they couldn't explain, let's say, everything about your brand model of your car or different types of common issues that happen with your car. If they cannot tell you that, you would trust them a lot less. But that's exactly how Google tries to understand your website, to see how much do you know. And if you really, really know all of your things in depth and you show how everything operates, and you really, for the most part, you're actually showing it to the Googles and how they perceive the world and how they understand that. So if you have a real expertise, you're able to explain everything in granular detail. And that's what Google tries to identify. And that's what they can assign, let's say, trust towards, or that's what they can say, there's an actual expert here and this can be given more traffic, because it looks like they know what they're talking about, just on the level of content that is presented. Mm-hmm. That makes sense?
Yes. So actually, how often should you adjust or update your topical map, and what are the criteria for doing that?
Sure. So if you're very actively working with the topical map and you already started processing it, I would recommend just trying to move, let's say, much quicker to complete it without really trying to break it or mess with it. in the middle of the process of, let's say, processing it. However, whenever you face different things with algorithm changes, let's say different helpful updates or core updates, and you can see that the most important part, some indices have shifted or changed. If you have made your plans according to those old index structures, but now they have changed, that means you are essentially executing a campaign for the outdated information. That's where you need to refresh. You need to be careful and aware of, essentially, it's all about Google's perception of, again, the world and what is being needed, what is being requested. And then you kind of play into these sort of play fields or kind of boxes that exist. When they shift, you need to adjust as well. Another part is not necessarily so much about the topical map, but it can slightly create a similar, there's a similar effect there. But in general, it's good to refresh your content. To be very honest, the more, the better. It's a little bit also about understanding the actual virality or popularity of certain topics and different trends that can occur. If you created an article about a trendy thing, but tomorrow it changed, you can become outdated just like that in 24 hours. But in general, try to refresh things at least every 6 months. By that point, you'll have enough Search Console data to see what has been actually happening in terms of where you have hit or miss for landing into these specific indices. But also you'll have hopefully a better understanding of your niche overall in terms of where there's more activity and where you can, let's say, sort of be a little bit more proactive in always staying updated or having like a fully completed set of information that you present.
And why some competitors fake queries?
Let me ask you, what do you mean by faking queries?
Like these are queries with no real traffic.
And do you mean that they write for these queries, or do you mean? So I assume we're looking at different kind of publicly available tools to see if there is a kind of search demand there or not. The point is that these tools are not really accurate enough to be very sort of deterministic and rely on it fully. In some cases, let's say the most optimistic scenario is if there is an actual expert behind that project and they know their niche really well. And the most important part, they know the client base very well. And they can look at a kind of a tool report and it will say that nobody's searching for this. But when these clients show up in the office, they're all asking that. So a person knows that this actually audience always seeking these types of answers, which is why usually the way it happens, they're just tired of explaining it. So they'll write an article about it and then say like, look, I have this thing to show, or if you really want to learn about it, everything is already explained over there. So that's kind of the most optimistic, the most, let's say, positive and nice scenario where that happens. Lots of other cases can be where there could be a kind of more of an, let's say, outdated type of approach to SEO when it comes to just traditional search. What SEOs will do, they'll just basically go find all the queries that exist, even spot the ones that have no search volume at all. But because they are focused on essentially writing about everything that exists within the queries, they'll just write about it, not caring if there are searches or not. And it's a little bit like a hit and miss type of scenario. But yeah, the tricky part with all of this is we need real world data. And this is, I think, one of the most fascinating parts about SEO in general. I think most SEOs actually forget that the searches, they come from real people. And the real people exist in the real world. And maybe the news have changed, maybe the trends have changed, maybe there is an innovation, maybe there are certain, let's say, economical changes or something else. and people's behavior can change to the point where they will search more or search less, which is why whenever you see a kind of a tool reporting, it tells you this is being searched, let's say 1,000 times a month, that really must mean that there will be exactly 1,000 people. I'm saying, of course, approximately, but around 1,000 people that will search this every single month. But that doesn't have to be like that. They might all go on a vacation, or they will all lose their phones magically, and nobody's gonna remember to search that. So remember, you're really dealing with people there. These keywords and that number next to it, it's just an approximation estimation. It's not the representation of the real world. It's a kind of rough guess. So that's where lots of these things can come from, actually.
Mm-hmm. So actually, can you figure out the topical gap between you and the competitor? Is it possible?
Of course. Remember what I mentioned about analyzing sitemaps of competitors, or just, let's say, pulling all of their titles and evaluating sort of the coverage that they have. This is one of the ways to do it. And of course, it can be done. As long as you can access their website, there's lots of different ways to scrape or parse the information, and then it's a matter of analyzing it.
Mm-hmm. Are there any tools that actually can help you track these metrics? For example, topical authority, topical gap, topical radius?
Sure. So I'm not really using any of these kinds of tools. As far as I'm aware at this moment, I don't think there are, unless someone came up with something. But to my awareness at this moment, I don't think there are any tools that do that.
Do you think there should be?
Of course. Yes, this is the actual... I think tools should exist to help people be more efficient at their job. And something like that would be greatly helpful for lots of SEOs to do a better job.
Business opportunity.
Of course.
For someone.
A big one.
Yeah. Awesome. What do you think about the current metrics that are offered by the common tools, like the keyword difficulty, domain rating? Are they still relevant, or would you say they're obsolete?
Let's say for some quick estimates, it's good to look at only some of those metrics that you mentioned. For the most part, it's really much better and a much more efficient approach is to understand, let's say, a search engine a little bit inside out, and then just have a first-hand analysis of what happens on the SERPs. That gives always a much clearer and a much more reliable picture, especially if we're talking about... I do see it that every single website is a business, and building a business, you really want to minimize all of your risks, which is why I think it's one of the least wise ways to just rely on the tools and kind of things they promise to you, and say, okay, we're gonna just go into that because these tools give us this great analysis. I think a great philosophy to life is if you just ask why like 3 times, or I also think it's good to ask it like infinite amount of times, because this tool tells you a certain, let's say, parameter or criteria that you should or should not do something. You should ask, well, why does it say that, or how does it know? And then find the answer, and then figure out, well, how does it know that, or why does it do that? Why not something else? And then sort of continue in this way, and many times you'll realize that there's not that much depth to lots of these things.
Do you build your own custom tools?
Yes, of course. I have custom coded solutions for these different things.
So are you able to actually track topical authority for your sites?
There's unfortunately very little things that I'm doing right now with tracking.
Okay.
It is mostly done for the helping of executing the campaign to save as much time as possible on lots of different, like, really tedious tasks. Because trying to evaluate and understand things by hand is efficient, but really, really like draining in terms of time.
Yeah.
So I think as much as I would love to develop and do much more, there is just, it's not possible to do everything all at once.
Yeah.
There is kind of priorities, or again, a ladder of priorities in place. And the first most important thing is the actual execution of these things. For the next future steps, tracking and analytics and these other things can come into play as well, of course.
Okay. So I wanted to change the topic a little bit. What is the role of structured data in semantic SEO?
So first thing, let's say about structured data. It is one of the, I will give a shout out to a really, really good friend, a expert Spanish SEO. His name is Luis Salazar Jurado. A very...
we will have an interview upcoming at SEO Estonia.
That's great. I really enjoy his knowledge and the information that he shares. Actually, he mentioned essentially his words is parsing, processing, and analyzing, evaluating structured data is the cheapest, the easiest way to work with any kind of content or even data that can exist. Essentially, when systems programmatically have to pass information to each other, structured data is the easiest way to do it. You can control different, let's say, formats, control different, let's say, types of information that are being passed and things like that. So it is really efficient. Now, when it comes to semantic SEO and structured data, a big important part here, within your contents, or let's just say pages or articles, you are providing certain information. It is really helpful if this information is repeated or backed again with the structured data. So there is a kind of repetition of what we just said, but in a more organized and structured way. As long as there is a match, search engine really, let's say, can realize that there's a lot more confidence here, and there's a lot more points to be much more efficient in terms of processing the site. But it's also a little tricky because it's very easy to break that. You can sort of keep it consistent, but then you can add a lot more information in your structured data than the actual content. So that becomes a kind of, let's say, mismatch, which is not ideal. But as long as there is a match and you provide like rich, accurate information on both levels, it is a very good to do. It's like an additional point to optimization. Of course, not to mention all kinds of different SERP features that you can gain just by adding these types of structures.
Yeah. So where is semantic search heading in 2025, and how is AI changing it?
So I think the understanding and precision of understanding is going to be much more accurate. We can see it in some of the research papers that Google is actually trying and testing a lot of different use cases to replace different types of parts of algorithms with LLM evaluations. So you can think that since AI already has nearly an entire world living in its training data and essentially its memory, it can be a much more efficient, let's say in some certain cases, evaluator or predictor or scorer, or even maybe to some extent like a comparer, like a comparison element. What this all means is that instead of relying on hard-coded, very precisely just algorithms that are based on maths, they can try to slightly, let's say, combine them or soften them up a little bit, but then use a kind of LLM overlooking or LLM correction element, which generally, what it seems so far, this type of processing becomes cheaper, which is the most important thing for Google, but also it becomes more efficient. Usually whenever any kind of engineer that is caring about cost optimization, it's kind of like a bingo, like you win a lottery, because you have win on both sides. For the most part, it's like we improve a system and we just became smarter, but the costs remain the same, or even unfortunately, they can go up. We can decrease the cost, but maybe we'll also lose the quality. But when you have both, where you lose or decrease the costs, but you also increase the quality, it's a huge change. And for the most part, as you understand, if they take different phrases, concepts, terms, queries, let's say rephrased queries or processed queries, there's lots of like maybe millions or billions of opportunities to find small elements or pieces of these algorithmic procedures where they can add an LLM, and it will just smoothen things up or just improve them significantly. Where this all leads is that there will be less misunderstandings, and there will be a much better precision in terms of overall documents that are being retrieved, and essentially results in the quality of search overall. When it comes to AI, that's a really long discussion, because there are many different things that happen on many different layers. You have obviously insane amount of spam that happens on purpose. You also do have a lot of things where what I would say kind of like innocent spam happens. Because I do think that probably, if I had to guess, at least, let's say 50 to 60% of people that have talked with ChatGPT, if they had any kind of curiosity or desire for any kind of digital marketing or digital presence, they realize this thing says great things, and I agree with them. I would like to share them on my website, or at least, let's say, part of them, or things like that. Or I can say, oh, I really want to write about these things, but this thing can help me so much, without even knowing what is SEO or what is any of these things. And they will just publish these types of contents, which then bloats the web. It messes a lot with, let's say, Google overall. It's like it's being kind of spammed without the intention of, creating that effect, which naturally leads for Google to be a lot more restrictive and careful, because, well, really, you can think of it like this. Google's wallet is like always open. And anytime someone is searching for something, Google is paying for that. So imagine if you have your wallet open and anyone can spend money from that wallet, and now you can see expenses really going up. But you also realize that the returns on that are not really there. So that's a really dangerous thing for Google to have, which is why they have to prevent it. They have to protect their system to avoid any kind of, let's say, insane overspendings. So they have to be a lot more, let's say, strict, both strict and restrictive in terms of what they allow, what they decide to work with, what they decide to index and serve and things like that. Another important thing, when it comes to AI, it's kind of like, just in two quick words, because it is trained on the overall like global knowledge of the internet, it's kind of like all the things that people have said. And it doesn't really know them precisely exactly at any single moment, but it sort of knows them approximately. What this means is that if we combine everything that existed on the web, let's say everything related to legal domain, if we summarize it, it kind of gets to like an average point. It knows much more than a junior or a beginner lawyer, let's say. But it's very far from the actual expert. It just knows that average level. If we're going to talk about, let's say, programming, or let's say philosophy, history, or something else, exact same situation over here. It will not know as much as the expert. It will just know kind of good enough on the average level. So what happens here is that you have, let's say, people that are complete beginners in, again, let's say, engineering or mechanics or things like that, but they decide, I'll make a website about mechanics. And with AI, they're able to bring the information down to essentially like the average level.
Yeah.
But so does everybody.
Yes.
So it's kind of like really search engines operate on quality thresholds or thresholds and scoring overall. And you just see that because everyone got access to AI, everyone just became average at everything.
Yeah.
You're now an average lawyer, an average dentist, an average physician, an average mechanic, because that's the knowledge of AI. So with these things, you can realize that if you were below the average, you might have been ranking if there was not that much competition. But now AI, because it is just higher on the thresholds, essentially can produce better content that, let's say, an amateur was able to produce. But then also, you can see it's kind of like everything has been a little bit pushed closer to the ceiling, or just the bar is being raised quite significantly. So, of course, that changes a lot in terms of, let's say, different levels of expertise that are required across different things, even from the point of the actual business or a business owner that you deal with, or just a company that you deal with. They really have to be experts to be able to help you or provide you, kind of like prove their expertise within their domain. If they do not have that, it becomes just much, much harder across the board. And this is the kind of like very strong, let's say, shift that AI brings for all these things.
So how do you actually go above that level?
One of the things is if you have a real experts, let's say a dentist that has worked in the industry for over 20 years, they really know what they're talking about. And if they hopefully, let's say, stay updated and they're aware of the newest technologies that are coming out and newest, let's say, treatment methodologies that are being developed or are already being practiced in some certain areas. That helps tremendously because essentially they are the real source of information. If that doesn't exist, then this kind of research and these kinds of levels of information have to be put together by someone, either by a researcher or something like that. Now comes the point, but AI also can do research, right?
Yes.
A little bit, but the tricky part with, let's say, AI researchers is a kind of bloating of that context window with lots of different tokens. Because really the way it works, it will go and try to, let's say, find information, then it will try to emphasize or specify this information, and it will do that iteratively for, let's say, certain amounts of loops. Then it really combined enormous amount of tokens within that context window, and it's now trying to give you a kind of reasonable output. But still, it is heavily prone to hallucinations, things that it misses lots and lots of like critical components. And for one of my recent speeches, I actually tested this for fun. Let's just say if I ask AI to do this research for me and find the cutting edge technology that exists right now, it was not able to find all of that. It found maybe like 4 out of 6 or 5 out of 6. But interestingly, the most important piece is not there. And of course, it can be a single scenario. You know, sometimes it can produce perfect outcomes, but AI is very, very convincing, and it makes itself look like it's very reliable, but unfortunately, it's not. So
how do you actually use AI safely for SEO purposes?
So let's say in terms of safety, we can think of it from slightly different angles. But I think the most important one and the most obvious one is if we are going to use AI to produce content, because that's what it seemingly does really well, just ask it like a short little phrase and it can write you paragraphs that are easy to read and full of information. The tricky part with all of this is that there are lots of different mechanisms that have been invented to try to track and trace whether the content was actually produced by AI or not. This is like a sub-industry that just invisibly evolved, and it continues to evolve. And the point is that as AI becomes smarter, these techniques also change over time. So what I would say is that, to be very honest, it's a little bit like a really long topic. I do see, and I can say that it is possible to produce AI content in a really good way with originality and, let's say, unique research and things like that. But it doesn't happen with just a single prompt or a few agents and things like that. It's a really much more in-depth process. Regarding safety, the safest thing to do is to actually just use AI for analysis, as if you already have done some kind of work, and then you say, evaluate it in lots of different ways. You can focus, let's say, on factuality or uniqueness or a kind of amount of, let's say, vague information or unfinished statements. You can look for different types of, let's say, fluency or cohesion, or even, let's say, style of language, or even a kind of sentiment around different statements. You can evaluate all of that perfectly and easily. And once it gives you this type of output, that becomes a very usable, actionable type of thing, how you can improve things further. The tricky part and the most dangerous part is if you write with AI, you take that thing that it wrote and directly put it to publishing. There's lots of different, let's say, in a simple way, footprints or watermarking systems that can be in place that are then very easy to detect. The good part is you can then clean up and refine these types of watermarks and footprints and things like that. But it becomes slightly more complex because there are lots of different ways to enforce that footprint, or it can be inherently integrated into the model. You need to be precisely aware of what kind of model you have, how it works, and sort of what it does. One of the most, let's say, interesting and promising things is distillation-based models. They are structured on a very different like fundamental principles. All of the most known systems like ChatGPT and Claude and Llama and whatever, they are all based on a transformers architecture. There's another architecture which is called distillation. This is really how AI images are produced. And what they have done here is they essentially try to produce text the way images are being produced. The point here is that all of the text is being written all at once, not word after word. It's like everything within a second. But then there are certain layers of corrections or tweakings. They remove some words, add other ones, remove, again, certain ones, add other ones. These are inherently, it looks like, much, much harder to track, but they perform really poorly in general. If you're trying to give it somewhat logical task, it's not really able to produce good enough outputs, at least not yet. And another, I think, one of the like funny and very obvious things is I would definitely not recommend to use Google Gemini to write content. Very obviously why. They can see it inside out and from every single angle, which model produced this content. Also, I will mention that understand what are the most used, most popular, biggest AI companies or AI or LLM providers who everyone is using. That's what Google has the biggest problem with. That's what they're trying to solve, track, and trace. So try to not use those models.
Okay.
Try to use the ones that are a little bit low-key, a little bit under the ground, a little bit not as well known. You'll be in a much safer spot, kind of just by a kind of like preset almost. And then from there, there are lots of additional, again, layers, techniques, and lots of other things that are quite important to just be aware of.
Okay. So what is like the most expensive semantic SEO mistake a brand can make?
Well, obviously just thinking that AI can do everything for you.
Okay.
And you can rely on it as your SEO expert and an expert content producer and everything else. So
A marketer.
yeah, AI can do lots of things. It can do them really greatly, but within the website, there's really lots of, within the reputation of the website, there's lots of different sensitive things. And it's good to try to build it up, protect it, and really try to be very, 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 let's say, careful and almost like sensitive about the whole structure of the website and the brand, and essentially the combination of two. A very costly mistake would be to sort of just, let's say, let's wing it. We saw that for Topical Authority, we need to cover everything. Let's go and ask AI to tell us what we should write and go deeper into that. A much better solution is to try to rely on the real actual research of what is actually going on and try to base your steps and your strategy leaning on these factually and properly researched type of, let's say, metrics or evaluations or even methodologies. And then probably the next biggest mistake or something that's connected to it is actually the opposite. It's being more kind of passive and not doing anything. Just hoping that Google will figure it out. Let's say we were doing one of our campaigns. Let's say we take a specific SEO vertical. We are just focusing on that. And we don't look further beyond that. We don't try to, let's say, create a more holistic approach towards the campaign and try to resolve all possible different angles. That's, let's say, it's not good to be stubborn, but it's good to be persistent.
Okay.
So if you're being persistent, try to also open your mind and perspective towards different angles and tackle all of them.
You shared so much knowledge here that can be overwhelming for someone who's a beginner. So actually, if you were to give one semantic SEO tactic that someone could implement and start with, what would that be?
I can give maybe two different ones, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
The one is, the first one is a little bit more, let's say, difficult or complex. It's something I mentioned before. I really recommend to study index construction because that will solve 80% of your problems. And that means you're also increasing your chance to increase your thresholds above your competitors. Because if they don't understand these things, but you do, that's where advantage comes from. Another thing, which is much simpler, try to update and refresh your content. Just go to Search Console, see what you have, what's the performance of any specific page within the last, let's say, 6 months. And if you're not happy with it, try to look at the SERPs, try to look at what you're targeting, and maybe there's actually a need, let's say, there for a kind of visual representation, but you do not have a single image that actually gives a kind of diagram or a chart. Just that single element can completely kind of overturn or change the direction of your impressions and clicks. And then update it, keep it fresh. As you do that, if you're not familiar with semantic principles as much, I really recommend you to pay attention to how much fluff and vague information you have right now within your sentences, And this is where you can easily use AI to help you identify all of that. And according to AI analysis, you can simply refine it, like clean it up, remove it from the content. This will become a much friendlier document or an article for the semantic search, and it's very easy to implement as well.
These are great tips, actionable. You can start from the beginning. Thank you so much for sharing all these semantic SEO hacks. If you enjoyed it, follow Pavel on Facebook and LinkedIn. You can also meet him at conferences. This is the best way to talk face to face, and he's very willing to talk about any semantic search problems. And if you like this video, please subscribe and like. Thank you.
Thank you.